I am absolutely delighted and thrilled that both David Lammy and Iain Duncan Smith have agreed to join us tonight for this incredibly important discussion. If the two of you could join me on the stage. Just if anyone isn't aware, Iain Duncan Smith is of course a Conservative MP and chair of the Centre for Social Justice, which is committed to tackling poverty. He is a former leader of the Tory party, of course, and he was the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions from 2010 to 2016. David Lammy is the MP for Tottenham. He has been the MP there for 18 years. He got re-elected last year. This isn't the first time that I've said this statistic, but I'll say it again because it is quite astonishing, with a vote of 82%. Politicians are always correcting me. Is that correct? 82%?
82%.
82% of the vote. He
Almost
was
as good as a dictatorship.
He was born in Tottenham. He was one of 5 children and raised by a single mother. As I said, thank you both for joining me this evening. David, I have just introduced you as somebody who was one of 5 children and you were brought up by your mum. Did you experience any of the things, the experiences that Stephen was talking about, or Kathy? How was it being one of 5 in Tottenham?
Well, yes. I mean, I experienced stigma because I didn't have a father. I experienced the stress, the emotional stress, the pressures of not being able to do things and worrying. I worried a lot about my mother because I knew if something happened to her, we would be finished. And obviously there were things that we couldn't have. But what I would say is that the nature of the poverty that I experienced, and I don't know if it was quite poverty, I would describe my background as working class, actually, but the nature of the life that I saw in my constituency in the 1970s and 80s was different to what I think we're talking about today, because our family, we owned our own home, and my mother had a job. She earned £12,000 a year, but she had an income. And I had some cousins that lived on the Broadwater Farm estate in my constituency, spent a lot of time with them, and they had the stability of their council home. And there, my aunt, she also worked as a nurse, and she had a husband who worked on London Underground. So what we had was quite a lot of stability, despite the fact that we didn't have a lot of money. And I think what's different today is what I would call a precariousness, a precariat. We've heard about not knowing where the next meal's coming from, not knowing if you're going to be staying in this temporary accommodation. If you are employed, not knowing how many hours you've got that week because of the gig economy and 0-hour contracts. And then because we've made changes to the welfare state, and actually I think put far more responsibilities on the individuals, often not knowing, because your employment's moving around and things, what your income's going to be if you're reliant on benefits or the welfare state. So what I see is a much more precarious existence for those who are poorer. And I see, and this is borne out by the figures and the statistics, when we talk about poverty here in London particularly, we've really got to understand we are talking about the working poor. People are working. So one of the phenomena for young people is that they are, because their parents or parent has to do more than 1 or 2 jobs, to get through, they're raising themselves often. So that phenomenon, we used to call it latchkey kid, but that's very real. And then I suppose because we're in the big bad city, the other dimension I would bring into this are those who exploit the situation. There are some real shysters out there. I'm afraid the pastor that we heard about before was a shyster who wanted the Mercedes. We've heard about drug dealers. And I've been raising some questions about real, serious, organised criminality. And this is my last point. We tend to focus a lot on the knives, a lot on the guns, And slightly, I feel a bit jaded after 18 years of that narrative. I think we need to focus far more on the organised gangsters that are trafficking cocaine and serious marijuana across our borders and through our countries. My experience is the average young 14, 15, 16-year-old carrying a knife in London doesn't even know that the cocaine comes from Colombia. He's got no idea how to get across a border. And so there's a lot of exploitation that comes into the mix where you've got this precarious existence.
Iain, Duncan Smith, David Lammy's analysis is bleak. It is depressing. It is terrifying if we talk about the impact of the vulnerable people then and how vulnerable they are to that level of crime. Do you agree, in your experience, with that analysis that poverty is different now? It's more precarious and it's worse.
Well, I didn't have exactly the same background as David. My father was a serviceman, so we travelled around all the time. In fact, I don't think we actually owned our own home until I was probably about 10 or 11, because that's when he left the armed forces and got our house. So we didn't have roots in any particular community until he had finished, and then he got another job. I do agree with David in this particular sense. Well, quite a lot, obviously, of what he said, but the reality is I think there is a problem in a sense that I can just deal with the criminality point. I set up the Centre for Social Justice because how you deal with poverty is to try and either just make it an issue solely of someone needs more money, give them more money, and that's it, or is it actually about why people are in that situation, and can you resolve and change what's happening to their lives? XLP is very much parked, I think, in that space. It's where it says, look, you somehow need to help yourself to take control of what's happening around you and to understand how best to manage your life, take it from there, and not to be taken over by people who want to use your position to get you to do things you'd otherwise not do. And we did a paper on this called Dying to Belong. It was actually a study of street gangs and how people have dealt with them in Cincinnati, Boston, Los Angeles, Strathclyde, Liverpool, and in London. If you want my honest view, I think London has actually the worst problem now, because places like Liverpool and Strathclyde are dealing with this in a much, much more holistic way and a better way. And a huge amount of the way you deal with this is getting kids back into remedial education, getting them out of the gangs, getting them out of the exploitation, and then solving their problems using organisations like XLP to change their lives rather than, and I agree with David, you can't police your way out of this. You can't just go in and keep on trying to stop people having knives and attacking people that may have guns, etc., because at the end of the day there's like a conveyor belt coming through, because somebody will always go down and find the next young person who's got a problem, has got difficulty, a dysfunctional home or something, a problem with not living in accommodation, and will feed off that. So this paper, actually, I wish we could get the whole of London to do this at the same time. You get my borough, Waltham Forest, did actually implement a lot of this, and for a while the levels of street gang problems, etc., fell, and then they pulled away the resources to a degree from the important groups like, as I say, keep coming back to XLP, but where they get people in remedial education, get them off drugs, get them settled in a proper house. And then we saw this rise again now of gang violence, which is going on, and that affects everybody in that community. So there are things we can do, but we have to do them all at the same time, and government is involved in that massively, but it's very much an issue now for the boroughs to get together and to decide they want to resolve this issue, because it stops anything happening in your community if this kind of gang warfare violence is going on, if the drug dealing is there, the kids get trapped in this process, the schools aren't safe places to go to, all that sort of stuff is the problem. So I agree with David on that, yeah.
How difficult is it for you, Iain? It's almost like a kind of schizophrenic existence where, on the one hand, you set up this think tank to look into poverty, and clearly it's a subject you're passionate about, and the very fact you're here tonight, and being part of the Conservative Party, where David has already suggested that some of the policies that the Tory government has brought in is in part led us to where we are tonight, talking about this and talking about especially the working poor and the phenomenon of food banks that we have now accepted as a normal part of living in Britain in the 21st century. How difficult is it for you being on the team that's, responsible for some of the situations we're in today?
Well, you set out to try and make the changes to the system so the system best serves those who need it most. One of the areas that when I walked through the door, I looked at it when we came in, was that you had this huge array, panoply of benefits, which were enormously confusing to lots of people that needed to get them, and quite often they don't get all of the money that they're due, even though they're due it and they could be claiming it. And it's confusing. I mean, David quite rightly said, people don't really know what they're due, and they're never quite certain what they're going to get, and if they make a decision about taking a job for a certain amount of hours, how much do I have in my pocket, do I lose money? They used to have to go back into the benefits centre to try and get a calculation done about whether or not they could take the extra hours if it was offered at work. So the first thing is to try and simplify it, and genuinely what's rolling out now will eventually be much better for them, because it'll putting it all together in one simple calculation, and the way it's rolling out is to try and make sure that if you discover there are issues, you can resolve them. I resigned from the government when I no longer could agree with them about the particular focus on specific savings, and I take a view that if you don't agree any longer, you can't. This is not a career. This is, at the end of their vocation. So, if you don't agree, you have to move. And I finally decided, after about a year of not being deeply uneasy about some of the stuff that we were doing. I wanted the reforms, but I didn't necessarily think that we needed to take the level of savings. We had a problem, debt and everything else, but there are certain limits, and I thought we'd gone to the edge of those limits and slightly beyond. So my view is I want some of that money that was taken out put back into these systems, because it will make them work better. But the key element of what I'm trying to get at, and this is the trouble with government at the end of the day, is you have to make these constant balanced choices where, the debate takes place about how you set these policies. And the reality is, government after government after government, and local authority after local authority, going back some considerable time, has simply failed to tackle the issue which stares us right in the face of housing. There is not sufficient housing, there is not good enough quality housing, and we have for too long kind of patched up and done short-term measures, no matter what the government is, Conservatives or Labour, etc. And we do have to somehow together, and I really mean this, together, decide that we're not going to use this and, for example, social services and things. We've got to try and take this out of the political atmosphere and say, instead of one party attacking the other when they come up with an idea and then it falls and then another one gets in and then we attack them and that falls as well, if we could agree, together agree how we're going to tackle this, I would love us to get our heads together. And I could get it together with him tomorrow, and I reckon we could resolve this problem if we had a blank sheet of paper just together. So my point is, when we sit down and talk, I have a huge amount of respect for David, because he's in his own area. He has campaigned enormously to try and get stable families together, to try and get people, into school, all that sort of stuff. I can see, a Labour MP who I have a huge regard for and admire. And I just think that once we get into that place and we start taking up our battle lines, what actually happens then is we kind of lose the idea that we might be able to do a little bit better for those who are in it. And so I think there are certain issues where we probably do need to sit down and say, OK, let's stop the toing and froing, and let's have a long-term plan that we all sit down together, we agree it, let's get on with it.
But the problem is, when there are respected voices calling for cross-party, long-term solutions to whether it's poverty or it's the NHS or social care, there's a lot of kind of support anecdotally for that, because people want grown-up conversations, and they don't want the toing and froing and the uncertainty of which party's going to be in next. But the problem is, it doesn't actually happen, because those who are in government at the time, for whatever reason, don't want to entertain those kind of long-term cross-party talks. And so even after Grenfell, where there was this moment where we could all take a step back and say, right, this is the manifestation of where we're at with housing, and I don't think there's anyone in the room or in the city who would not disagree with your analysis that housing needs to be sorted out. But it doesn't feel as if that there's any real momentum, even after Grenfell, to sort it out. Do you think, David, the Haringey situation may start to change that, whereby people on estates who are seeing their estates regenerated, perhaps not what they in the way that they want to, could lead to people power, and people living in those estates having the power to say, we don't want this, we just want a decent place to live, a decent place to rent, a decent place to buy? Or is that moment not going to happen as well?
Well, look, let me be positive for a second. So it is the case that Iain and I have shared lots of platforms together over the 18 years that I've been in Parliament. We are both Christians. We both support Spurs. We would be at Wembley tonight if we weren't here. So there are friendships and built around kind of mutual respect beyond the party divide. However, I think that the second point I'd make is that there are also these huge moments that can occur, and I think of the birth of the modern welfare state after the Second World War would be probably the one that's foremost in my mind, where somehow politics can come together and you can work across the political divide. However, my analysis of Britain today is that there's quite a lot going on where bridging that divide feels quite difficult. I think that we've come out of an age of centre ground politics, and there are powerful forces on both sides of the political spectrum that mean that coming together feels a bit problematic in our system. I think also that the big divides in society, frankly, in this room, is between the asset class, those of us who bought homes in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early noughties, particularly if they're in London or the South East, and they're worth a hell of a lot of money. You can remortgage, make more money, and effectively it's a tax-free asset. And those who do not have assets, a younger generation, broadly under 35, and those who would have been in council homes, except we've not built them anymore, and also those in parts of the country beyond London where house has not seen the sort of rises that we've seen in London and the South East. And that divide is huge, because I would argue that we've set up a society in which it's actually quite hard to survive unless you have an asset. That's the society we've created. We've moved a long way from the days, anyone who watches Call the Midwife, you see people moving into their council homes and feeling such pride at this wonderful new home they've got. Now, as we heard before, there's so much stigma attached to housing if you don't own it. And we've moved a long way from that. We aren't building anymore. So housing is at the centre of this. The asset divide is quite big. There's something else going on. Successive politicians, both parties have said this, we need to devolve hand power back to people and communities. I'm afraid then the parties get into office and hoard the power at the centre. Local authorities really have just been decimated. I mean, in a sense, one sees this with Kensington and Chelsea and Grenfell, a lack of capacity to respond, it seems to me. And I'm not going to say that that's unique to a Conservative council, actually. I think that there may well be Labour councillors who would respond who would struggle to respond, struggle to get into the business of civic, because the local authority basically takes your rubbish away every 2 weeks, runs a few schools, but many of those are now academies, maybe keeps the park, but doesn't do much else, and sort of has lost touch with how to do that. So I think there are some big problems in Britain. I worry about how we. My first book was on this, really, how we get back to collective exercises, how we're not just a society of many, many individuals who struggle to come back together again and work together on collective endeavour.
All right, David Lammy and Iain Duncan Smith, thank you for now. I know you're going to join me a little later on the panel, but thank you very much. We'll discuss solutions in greater depth in a few minutes. Thank you so much. Thank you.